I am dictating this from a medical cradle aboard the Sovereignty flagship, Unyielding Resolve, and I need you to understand that I have not stood upright in 11 rotations. Every bone in my lower thorax is fractured. My left lung has partially collapsed under its own weight, which is a sentence that should make no medical sense to anyone hearing this debrief, and yet here I am, wheezing it into the record like a confession. My name is Fleet Commander Vizhal of the Tyrellan Dominance, and I was given command of the Southern Hemisphere Assault Corridor during the invasion of the planet known to its inhabitants as Earth. I am recording this because the High Stratagem has demanded a full account of how 90,000 of our finest ground troops were defeated in less than 40 hours by a world we classified as a soft target. I will give that account, but I want it noted, formally and for all time, that the word defeated does not begin to describe what happened to us on that planet. We were not defeated. We were crushed, and I mean that in the most literal, physical, unpoetic sense of the word. The intelligence briefings had been thorough. I will give our analysts that much. 6 months before the invasion order came down, our long-range survey drones had mapped every continent, cataloged every military installation, intercepted and decoded what the humans called radio and television broadcasts. We knew their population centers. We knew their weapons systems. We knew their political divisions, their languages, their supply chains. On paper, Earth was everything the Dominants had been looking for, a fractured world. No unified planetary government, no energy shielding, no orbital defense platforms, no faster-than-light capability. Their most advanced weapons were nuclear fission devices they were apparently too afraid to use on each other, which told us everything we thought we needed to know about their temperament. The High Stratagem approved full planetary annexation with a confidence rating of 98%. 6 carrier groups, 90,000 ground troops, 400 armored vehicles, atmospheric gunships, field medical stations, and enough supplies to sustain a 3-month occupation, which was considered generous. Most analysts predicted total capitulation within 2 weeks. I reviewed those briefings personally. I signed off on them. I want that in the record too. The assault plan was clean and conventional. 3 corridors, Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, and a Pacific Naval Suppression Force to neutralize island-based resistance. I was assigned the Southern Corridor, targeting the largest landmass in the lower hemisphere, a region the humans called South America. Dense vegetation, scattered population centers, significant river systems. My forces would establish a forward operating base in the jungle interior, push outward to the coastlines, and link up with the Northern Corridor forces within 72 hours. I had done this before on 4 other worlds. I had never lost a campaign. We entered Earth's orbit on what the humans measure as a Tuesday. I remember watching the planet fill the observation viewport and thinking it looked heavier than it should. That is not a scientific observation. That is not something a fleet commander should say in an official debrief. But I am saying it because it was the first honest thought I had about that world, and I should have listened to it. The oceans were too dark. The cloud systems were too thick. Everything about the planet looked dense and substantial, in a way that our homeworld, with its pale skies and shallow seas, simply did not. The drop pods launched on schedule. 1,200 pods carrying the first wave, punching through the upper atmosphere in a coordinated descent pattern we had executed dozens of times on dozens of worlds. The first anomaly registered 90 seconds into atmospheric entry. My navigation officer, a careful and experienced woman named Sulia, flagged it before anyone else noticed. The gravitational pull readings were wrong. Not slightly wrong, drastically wrong. Our instruments were showing a surface gravity of 9.8 meters per second squared. That was nearly 3 times the pull of our homeworld. Sulia looked at me, and I could see the question in her face, but I did what any commander would do when the numbers did not match the intelligence briefing. I assumed the instruments were miscalibrated. Atmospheric interference, I told her. Compensate and continue. That decision will follow me for the rest of my life, however long or short the stratagem allows that to be. The pods hit the jungle canopy of the target zone, like stones dropped into water. There is no other way to describe it. The deceleration thrusters, calibrated for a gentle touchdown at 0.34 standard gravity, fired at full capacity and barely slowed us. My pod struck the ground with enough force to crater the earth beneath it, and the crash harness that was supposed to hold me secure instead became a crushing vice across my chest. I heard 3 of my rib analogs snap like dry branches. The pain was immediate and absolute, a white flash behind my eyes that lasted long enough for me to understand that something had gone terribly, fundamentally wrong. I forced the pod hatch open and dragged myself out onto the surface of the planet Earth, and for the first time in my career, my legs refused to hold me. I want to be precise about this because it matters. I did not trip. I did not stumble. I did not lose my footing on unfamiliar terrain. I stood up, and the planet pulled me down. My legs, my strong and battle-tested legs, that had carried me across 4 conquered worlds, buckled like they were made of wet cloth. The weight of my own body was suddenly and impossibly wrong. My armor, which weighed almost nothing on the homeworld, and had never been more than a comfortable second skin, now pressed down on my shoulders and spine like someone had filled it with stone. I went to my hands and knees in the dirt of an alien jungle, and I could not get up. Around me, across the entire landing zone, the same thing was happening to every soldier in the first wave. 1,200 drop pods had delivered 1,200 trained warriors onto the surface of this world, and nearly all of them were on the ground. Some were screaming, some were trying to crawl. A lieutenant named Craven, one of the strongest soldiers in my personal guard, managed to get to his feet for perhaps 3 seconds before his right femur analog snapped under the strain, and he went down with a sound I will never be able to forget. The medics could not reach the wounded because the medics could not walk. I lay there in the humid red mud, breathing air that was so thick with oxygen it burned my throat, and I tried to understand what was happening. The gravity was real. The instruments had not been wrong. This planet, this world of soft targets and primitive weapons and fractured politics, had a gravitational pull nearly 3 times our homeworld standard, and somehow, impossibly, the creatures who lived here had evolved to thrive in it. I managed to key my communicator with fingers that felt like they each weighed as much as my whole hand should. I raised the unyielding resolve on a crackling, interference-heavy channel and demanded an update from the other landing zones. The reports came back in fragments, each one worse than the last. Northern Corridor, same conditions. Pacific Force, same conditions. Every single unit that had touched the surface of this planet was on the ground, unable to advance, unable to retreat, unable to do anything but lie in the dirt and try to breathe against the weight of an atmosphere that pressed down on our chests like a slow and patient hand. I was still processing this when I heard them coming. The sound reached us before anything else did, a deep rhythmic chopping in the air, growing louder, and then the machines appeared above the tree line. The humans called them helicopters, crude rotary wing aircraft, loud and graceless by our standards, held aloft by spinning blades that fought against the very gravity that had pinned us to the ground. They hovered above the landing zone with a casual stability that made my stomach turn, because in that moment, I understood something that changed the entire calculus of the invasion. These creatures did not merely survive in this gravity. They had built machines to fly in it. I tried to raise my sidearm. I truly did. The weapon weighed almost nothing by human standards, perhaps 2 kilograms. But in that moment, with my broken ribs grinding against each other and my arm muscles trembling from the simple act of holding themselves up, I could not lift it above chest height. I could not aim. I could not fight back. I lay on the surface of their world with a weapon in my hand and the absolute, shattering knowledge that I might as well have been holding a rock. The helicopters circled twice and pulled back. They did not fire. At the time, I did not understand why. Later, much later, I realized they were doing exactly what we would have done if 1,200 enemy soldiers had landed on our homeworld and immediately collapsed in a heap. They were assessing. They were being cautious, not because they were afraid, but because they could not believe it was this easy, and they suspected a trap. There was no trap. There was only gravity, doing what it had always done, what it would always do, and us, lying beneath it like insects under a boot we never saw coming. I ordered my communications officer to send a priority alert to all ground forces. Defensive positions only. No advance. No movement unless absolutely necessary. Conserve energy, conserve oxygen, and wait for further orders. It was the most humiliating transmission I have ever authorized. and it was the only correct decision I made that entire day. The jungle around us was alive in ways I had not anticipated. Sounds came from every direction, creatures calling to each other in the dense canopy above, things moving through the undergrowth with a speed and ease that mocked our immobility. The air was so warm and so wet that our cooling systems were already straining, and I could feel sweat pooling inside my armor in places I did not know could sweat. The sun, their star, pressed down through gaps in the canopy with a heat that felt personal, like it was specifically targeting us. Somewhere in the distance, perhaps 2 or 3 kilometers from our position, I heard something that took me a long moment to identify. It was engines, ground vehicles, human ground vehicles, approaching at speed through terrain that our own armored transports would not have been able to cross at any speed. They were coming, and we could not run, and we could not stand, and we could not fight. And in that moment, lying in the mud of a planet that no one in the dominance had ever taken seriously, I understood with perfect and terrible clarity that the invasion of Earth was already over. It had been over the moment we touched the ground. The humans arrived 40 minutes after the helicopters pulled back. I heard their vehicles stop at the edge of the crater field, heard doors opening, heard voices calling to each other in a language I did not yet understand. And then I heard something that I will carry with me until the day I die. Footsteps. Fast, heavy, confident footsteps, moving through the jungle at a pace that should not have been possible for any living creature, on any world I had ever known. Not running, just walking at a normal pace on a planet with nearly 10 meters per second squared of gravitational acceleration, carrying weapons and armor and equipment without the slightest visible strain. They moved through the undergrowth like it was not there, stepping over roots and ducking under branches with a fluid, practiced ease that made my best soldiers look like broken machines. I watched a human step over a fallen tree trunk that was half a meter high, without slowing down. A casual motion, a nothing motion, and I felt something I had never felt before in 40 years of military service. I felt completely and irreversibly outmatched, not outgunned, not outmaneuvered, not outsmarted, outbuilt, out-me-volved, out-gravitated, if such a word exists. And if it does not, then let the record show that Fleet Commander Vijal of the Torellan Dominance coined it here, in the mud, on the worst day of his life. They surrounded the landing zone within minutes. I counted at least 60 of them in my immediate field of vision, and there were certainly more in the tree line that I could not see. They moved in coordinated fire teams, covering each other, communicating with hand signals and short vocal commands, and every single one of them held their weapons steady and level with an ease that made me want to weep. Their rifles looked heavy, solid metal and polymer construction, no energy cells, no plasma chambers, just mechanical devices built to accelerate small pieces of metal at very high speeds, using controlled chemical explosions. Primitive by every standard I knew. And every single one of those primitive weapons was aimed directly at soldiers who could not lift their own arms to respond. A voice called out from the tree line, loud, clear, and utterly unafraid. I did not understand the words at the time, but I later learned it was a simple command, in a language called Portuguese. The soldier was telling us to drop our weapons. Drop them, as if we were holding them up. I let my sidearm fall from my fingers into the mud. It was not a surrender, it was an acknowledgement of physics. The humans stepped into the landing zone with their weapons raised, and for the first time, I saw one of them up close. He was tall by our standards, well over a body length and a half, and broad across the shoulders in a way that spoke of a skeleton built to bear enormous loads. His legs were thick, his arms were thick, and he moved with the kind of confident, grounded stability that comes from a lifetime of fighting against a force that never lets up and never lets go. He looked down at me with an expression I could not read, and then he did something that confused me so completely that I forgot, for a moment, that I was in pain. He reached down with one hand and lifted my helmet off my head, not aggressively, not violently, gently, the way you might lift a cup from a table. My helmet weighed 4 kilograms. He picked it up like it was made of paper, turned it over in his hands, examined it briefly, and set it down beside me with a carefulness that bordered on tenderness. Then he spoke into his radio, and even though I did not understand the words, I understood the tone. He was not calling for reinforcements. He was not requesting permission to engage. He was telling someone, calmly and without urgency, that the situation was under control. And it was. Completely, totally, and humiliatingly under control. I did not know it yet, but across the planet, in every landing zone, in every corridor, the same scene was playing out. The greatest military force the Tyrellan dominance had ever assembled was lying face down on the surface of a world that had beaten us without firing a single shot. The planet had done it. The gravity had done it. And the humans, those impossible, heavy-boned, thick-muscled creatures who had evolved in a crucible we could not even stand up in, were simply there to watch it happen. This was the end of the first hour. I had 39 more to go before someone finally carried me off that world. Carried me, like an infant, in the arms of a species we had come to conquer. I need a moment before I continue this debrief. The medic is telling me my blood pressure is spiking, which is what happens when you ask a fleet commander to relive the most catastrophic military failure in the history of his civilization, while lying on his back in a cradle designed for hatchlings. I will continue, but I want a glass of water first, and I want it noted that even the act of drinking water is easier up here, in the gentle pull of our ship's artificial gravity, than anything I experienced on the surface of that impossible planet. Give me a moment. I have a great deal more to say. The water helps. The medic does not approve of me continuing, but the medic does not outrank me, and the high stratagem wants this debrief completed before the next rotation cycle. So I will continue, and I will start with the part that haunts me most from those first hours. Not the pain, not the humiliation, the speed. I need to talk about how fast the humans moved, because until you have seen it from ground level, lying in the dirt with your broken ribs and your useless legs, you cannot understand what it means to watch a creature that was born in a gravity well, nearly 3 times your own, move at full capability. Our intelligence files described human military forces as mobile. That word is so inadequate it borders on disinformation. They were not mobile, they were fluid. They poured through that jungle like water through a cracked dam, and they did it carrying equipment that would have pinned any Tyrellan soldier to the floor. The first ground units arrived within 40 minutes of our landing, which meant they had mobilized, loaded into vehicles, driven across kilometers of dense tropical terrain, dismounted, and established a tactical perimeter around our crash site in less time than it took my soldiers to crawl from their drop pods to the nearest piece of cover. I want to repeat that because I think it is the single most important tactical observation in this entire debrief. We were slower getting out of our own landing craft than they were getting to us from their bases. The implications of that are staggering, and I do not think the stratagem fully appreciates them yet. The human soldiers who surrounded our position were part of what I later learned was a rapid response brigade from the nation-state called Brazil. There were approximately 200 of them in the immediate area, with more arriving by the minute in vehicles and those rotary aircraft. They were organized, disciplined, and visibly well-trained. But what struck me more than their training was their physicality. Every one of them was a monument to what evolution produces when a species spends millions of years fighting a gravity field that would kill any Tyrellan in a matter of days. Their legs were columns of dense muscle and heavy bone. Their spines were reinforced with a structural integrity that our own skeletal systems could not approach. They carried packs on their backs that weighed more than our soldiers' entire body armor, and they carried them like they were not there. I watched a female soldier, a small one by their standards, jog past my position with a piece of equipment on her back that our logistics database later identified as a field radio unit weighing approximately 22 kilograms. She was running, comfortably, in full combat gear, on a planet where I could not lift my head without my neck muscles trembling. She did not even glance at me as she passed, and in that dismissal, that casual lack of concern, I understood more about the balance of power on this planet than all our intelligence briefings had ever told me. The first engagement happened approximately 90 minutes after our landing, though calling it an engagement gives it a dignity it did not deserve. A group of my soldiers in the eastern section of the landing zone, perhaps 30 of them, attempted to resist when the human perimeter tightened. They were veterans, experienced fighters who had served with distinction on 3 prior campaigns, and they did what any good soldier would do when surrounded by an enemy force. They opened fire. Their plasma bolts tore through the jungle canopy and set several trees ablaze, which was impressive and completely useless. The bolts arced downward far more sharply than intended because our weapon systems were calibrated for a gravity field roughly 1/3 of what they were operating in. Shots aimed at center mass struck the ground 3 meters in front of the targets. Shots aimed high went wide as the lateral drift calculations failed to account for the increased downward pull. Out of perhaps 200 bolts fired in that initial exchange, our soldiers scored 0 hits. Not one. 200 rounds from trained marksmen, and every single one of them missed because the planet itself was bending our fire into the dirt. The humans returned fire immediately, and this is where the true disparity revealed itself. Their weapons, those crude kinetic projectile launchers, were designed from the ground up for this gravity. Every component, every calculation, every instinct their soldiers had developed over a lifetime of training had been built around the reality of firing a weapon at 9.8 meters per second squared. Their rounds did not arc. Their rounds did not drift. Their rounds came in fast and flat and hit exactly where they were aimed, and our armor, designed to disperse energy weapon impacts, offered almost no resistance to small pieces of metal traveling at 900 meters per second. 14 of my soldiers were killed in that exchange. The humans lost no one. The engagement lasted less than 20 seconds. I ordered an immediate ceasefire across all units, which was the second correct decision I made on that planet, and I believe, the action that prevented the casualty count from climbing into the thousands in that first afternoon alone. My soldiers could not fight. That was no longer a tactical assessment. It was a physical fact. We could not aim our weapons. We could not move to cover. We could not advance or retreat, or do any of the things that a fighting force is supposed to do. We were a military formation in name only. In reality, we were 90,000 casualties waiting to be counted. I tried a different approach. If we could not move as infantry, perhaps our vehicles could compensate. I contacted the carrier group in orbit and requested immediate deployment of armored ground units. 16 heavy assault platforms, tracked vehicles with plasma cannons, and reinforced hull plating, the pride of the Torellan ground forces. They were dropped on rapid deployment pallets to a clearing approximately 1 kilometer from my position, and I listened on the command channel as the vehicle commanders powered up their systems and began to move toward us. They made it approximately 40 meters before the first one sank. The soil of the Amazon basin, which our surveys had classified as firm tropical ground, was in fact a soft, moisture-saturated layer of organic material overlying clay. Under Torellan homeworld conditions, our vehicles would have rolled across it without issue. Under Earth conditions, each vehicle weighed approximately 3 times what it was designed to weigh, and the ground simply could not support them. Track systems designed for light, dry terrain dug into the wet earth and kept digging. Engines built to move a certain mass at a certain gravity, strained and overheated, trying to push 3 times that mass through sucking mud. Within 20 minutes, all 16 vehicles were immobilized. 3 of them had sunk to their turret rings. The crews had to be evacuated on foot, which meant they had to crawl, which meant the humans watched them crawl, which meant that somewhere on this planet, there exists footage of Torellan armored vehicle crews dragging themselves through the mud, away from their own equipment, like wounded animals. I know this footage exists because by this point, the humans were broadcasting everything. I intercepted my first human media transmission approximately 4 hours into the invasion, when one of our signals analysts managed to decode a visual broadcast frequency. The image that appeared on my cracked tactical display was a human news program, complete with 2 presenters sitting behind a desk and a large screen showing aerial footage of one of our Northern Hemisphere landing zones. Torellan soldiers were visible on the screen, scattered across a grassy field in what appeared to be Central Europe, struggling to move, some crawling, some simply lying still. The human presenters were talking rapidly, and although we did not yet have full translation capability, their tone was unmistakable. They were amused, not frightened, not angry, not rallying their population for a desperate defense against an alien invasion force. They were entertained. One of them was smiling. The other appeared to be suppressing laughter. Behind them, The screen showed a human in civilian clothing, walking calmly among the prone Torellan soldiers, filming them with a small handheld device while talking directly into it. Later translation revealed he was narrating a personal broadcast for something the humans called social media, and his commentary was predominantly comedic in nature. I contacted Subfleet Leader Drenath, who was commanding the Northern Hemisphere assault corridor targeting Europe. His voice on the channel was something I had never heard from him before, a flatness, a hollowness, the sound of a career officer watching his legacy disintegrate in real time. He confirmed what the broadcast showed. His forces were in the same condition as mine, total immobility, no effective resistance capability. Human military forces had established a perimeter around every landing zone, but in many cases had not even bothered to confiscate weapons, because Torellan soldiers who could not stand had no practical way to use them. Drenath told me that in one sector, a group of human civilians had set up what appeared to be a temporary market, selling food and beverages at the edge of the military cordon, as if the invasion were a sporting event or a festival. I asked Drenath if he had attempted vehicle deployment. He had. His results were identical to mine. The heavy transports had cracked a paved road surface under their earth weight and sunk into the substrate beneath. His lighter scout vehicles had fared marginally better, but could not achieve speeds above 12 kilometers per hour before their engines overheated. We ended the communication with no plan and no hope. There was nothing to plan for. We were an invasion force that could not invade. Night fell on the Amazon basin and brought no relief. The darkness was absolute beneath the jungle canopy, and the sounds of the forest changed character entirely. Things moved in the trees above us, large things, and the constant chorus of what I later learned were insects created a wall of noise that made communication difficult even at short range. The temperature dropped slightly, but the humidity climbed, and condensation began forming inside our armor systems, shorting out secondary electronics and creating a clammy, suffocating feeling against the skin. I spent that night lying in the command pod with my fractured ribs wrapped in emergency binding, listening to status reports that grew progressively worse. Across all three assault corridors, the story was the same. Soldiers were unable to move. Equipment was failing. Supplies that should have lasted weeks were being consumed at triple the projected rate, because our bodies were burning energy at an enormous pace, just trying to function in this gravity. And through it all, the humans watched from their perimeters, rotated their guard shifts, and waited. They were waiting for us to realize what they already knew, that this planet was not a battlefield. It was a trap, and it had been a trap long before we arrived, long before the first Torellan survey drone ever swept through this solar system. It was a trap built by physics itself, a world so heavy, so dense, so brutally and relentlessly pulled toward its own center, that anything not born in its grip would be broken by it. By dawn of the second day, I had reached the same conclusion, but the high stratagem had not, and that is where the real catastrophe began. The morning light came through the canopy in shafts so bright they hurt my eyes, and with it came the heat. I have campaigned on desert worlds, on volcanic moons, on planets with surface temperatures that would melt Torellan standard equipment. None of them prepared me for the suffocating, pressing, inescapable heat of a tropical morning on Earth. The humidity was so high that the air itself felt heavy in my lungs, and breathing became a conscious effort. Each inhale a battle against the weight of an atmosphere that was denser and richer in oxygen than anything our respiratory systems had evolved to process. Several soldiers in my immediate vicinity had developed what the field medics called oxygen toxicity, a condition where the sheer abundance of breathable gas in Earth's atmosphere overwhelmed their blood chemistry and caused dizziness, nausea, and in 2 cases, seizures. I transmitted my second status report to the unyielding Resolve at 0600 local time. The numbers were devastating. Of the 12,000 troops under my direct command in the southern corridor, fewer than 3,000 could still move at all, and of those, none could move at anything faster than a crawl. We had taken 416 fatalities, most from impact injuries during landing, a smaller number from the brief firefight, and a growing number from what I can only describe as gravitational trauma, hearts failing under the strain of pumping blood against 3 times the resistance they were designed for, spinal columns compressing and pinching nerve clusters, joint structures cracking under the sustained load of body weight that exceeded all evolutionary tolerances. My soldiers were being killed by the act of existing on this planet. The High Stratagem's response arrived within the hour, and when I read it, I felt something break inside me that was not a bone. It was an order for escalation. Orbital bombardment of human population centers to force capitulation. The stratagem had concluded that if our ground forces could not function, we would bypass them entirely and strike from space, where gravity was our servant and not our enemy. It was, in isolation, a logical decision. It was also the decision that proved the stratagem did not understand what we were dealing with. The carrier groups aligned above their assigned targets and prepared to fire. The weapon of choice was kinetic impactors. Dense metal rods accelerated from orbit to strike the surface at tremendous velocity. Simple physics. Drop something heavy from very high up and let gravity do the rest. It was a weapon system that had reduced cities to rubble on a dozen worlds. But on those worlds, the gravity had been 0.3 or 0.4 standard. On Earth, it was nearly 10 meters per second squared, and our targeting computers had never, in their entire operational history, been asked to calculate an impact trajectory in a field that strong. The first volley launched, and I tracked the rods on my tactical display as they entered the atmosphere. They accelerated. Of course they accelerated. They accelerated far beyond the projected terminal velocity, because the computers had underestimated the pull by a factor that should have been corrected before the first pod ever launched. The rods came down too fast, too hot, and at angles that deviated from their intended trajectories by margins that were measured in kilometers, not meters. The first target was a coastal city in the southern hemisphere. The rods missed it entirely and struck the ocean 12 kilometers offshore, sending up columns of water that were impressive and strategically meaningless. The second volley was corrected, partially. The targeting officers aboard the carriers adjusted their calculations in real time, feeding in the actual gravitational data that they should have been using from the start. The rods came closer to their targets, but the overcorrection introduced new errors. These rods hit land, but they hit with such excessive force that they buried themselves deep underground, instead of detonating on the surface. The impacts registered on human seismographic equipment as small earthquakes. They cracked foundations. They startled civilians. They did not destroy a single building. I watched this from the ground and felt a resignation so complete it was almost peaceful. We could not walk on their planet. We could not drive on their planet. We could not even bombard their planet correctly, because the same gravity that had pinned us to the dirt was bending our weapons away from their targets with a casual, almost contemptuous indifference. And then the humans stopped waiting. The counterattack began at approximately 0900 local time, and it came from the sky. Human fixed-wing aircraft, the things they called fighter jets, appeared over the jungle in formations that moved so fast our tracking systems could not maintain a lock. These aircraft were not technological marvels by galactic standards. They were tubes of metal with combustion engines strapped to them, and they should not have been able to perform the maneuvers I watched them perform. They turned at angles that would have torn Tyrellan aircraft apart, because our aircraft were not built to withstand the G-forces that human pilots routinely subjected their bodies to. A human pilot pulling a 9-gravity turn was experiencing discomfort. A Tyrellan pilot pulling a 9-gravity turn was experiencing death. The jets made 2 passes over the landing zones. On the first pass, they dropped nothing. They were doing what their ground forces had done the day before, assessing, cataloging, making sure they understood the tactical picture before they committed. On the second pass, they dropped ordnance. The explosions walked through the eastern section of my landing zone in a neat, precise line that spoke of targeting systems built by creatures who understood exactly how objects fell in their gravity. Each bomb hit within meters of its intended target. Each detonation was calculated to produce maximum effect within a defined radius. There was no waste, no overshoot, no undershoot. These weapons had been designed by a species that had spent its entire technological history learning to work with 9.8 meters per second squared instead of against it, and the results were devastating. A single airstrike eliminated an entire armored battalion, not damaged, eliminated. 16 vehicles and their crews, the same vehicles that had sunk into the mud the day before and never moved again, were reduced to burning wreckage in the span of 11 seconds. I know it was 11 seconds, because the tactical recorder in my command pod was still functioning, and I have reviewed the footage more times than is healthy for my psychological state. After the airstrike, the ground assault intensified. Human infantry advanced through the jungle toward our perimeter with a confidence that I can only describe as casual. They did not rush. They did not take excessive cover. They moved at a steady walking pace, weapons up, scanning their sectors, communicating in low voices, and they closed the distance to our positions faster than my soldiers could have crawled away from them. I watched a human squad leader direct his team through a gap in our defensive line by pointing with one hand, while holding his rifle steady in the other. He was holding a 4-kilogram weapon in one hand, like it was a writing instrument. The biological toll by this point was catastrophic. After approximately 18 hours on the surface, the gravitational stress on Tyrellan physiology had moved beyond discomfort and into systemic failure. Our field medics were documenting conditions they had never seen before, conditions that had no names in Tyrellan medical literature because they described the effects of prolonged exposure to a force that no Tyrellan had ever been subjected to. Skeletal microfractures were spreading through every soldier who had attempted to stand or walk. Cardiovascular systems were beginning to fail, as hearts designed to pump blood through bodies weighing 40 kilograms at homeworld gravity were now pumping blood through bodies that effectively weighed over 100. Fluid was accumulating in cranial cavities because the drainage systems in our skulls could not overcome the downward pressure, and this was causing vision problems, headaches, and in several cases, dangerous increases in intracranial pressure. I was coughing fluid by this point. My lungs, already damaged by the landing impact, were slowly filling under their own weight. The field medic assigned to my command pod told me, with a directness I appreciated, that if I was not evacuated to a zero-gravity medical facility within the next 12 hours, the fluid accumulation would reach a level that my body could not clear, and I would drown. I would drown inside my own chest, on dry land, killed by the weight of my own lungs. And it was not just us the planet was trying to kill. The environment itself was hostile in ways that went beyond gravity. The insects were relentless, clouds of biting, stinging organisms that found every gap in our armor and targeted the wounded with a persistence that suggested malice. The heat caused our cooling systems to cycle at maximum capacity until their power cells began to drain. The vegetation grew so thick and so fast that paths cleared during the night were partially overgrown by morning. Everything on this planet grew and moved and lived with an aggressive vitality that spoke of a biosphere that had spent billions of years competing for survival in a gravity field that punished weakness without mercy. The river was the worst of it. There was a major waterway running through the western edge of our landing zone, and our tactical maps had identified it as a potential crossing point. The satellite imagery showed a broad, relatively shallow body of water that looked manageable. What the satellite imagery did not convey was the force of a river driven by a planet with nearly 10 meters per second squared of gravitational pull. The current was not a flow. It was a wall of moving water that carried the weight of a world behind it. And when a platoon of 36 soldiers attempted to wade across at what appeared to be a shallow point, the river took them. I do not mean it swept them off their feet. I mean it erased them. 36 soldiers in full armor, already weakened by 18 hours of gravitational stress, were pulled under and carried downstream so quickly that the soldiers watching from the bank did not even have time to reach for them. The river moved that fast. Water, which we think of as gentle and yielding, became an unstoppable force when accelerated by a gravity field that strong, and it killed 36 trained warriors in less time than it takes me to describe it. I learned later, from a human soldier who told the story with no awareness of its cruelty, that a child had been standing on the far bank of that river when my soldiers drowned. A small human, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, who had apparently walked down to the riverbank to watch the commotion, and while 36 Tyrellan soldiers were being dragged to their deaths by the current, this child was skipping stones across the water, picking up flat rocks, flicking them sidearm with a practiced, casual motion, and watching them bounce across the surface of the river that was killing my people. The child's arm generated enough force, in a simple playing motion, to make a stone defy the surface tension of water moving at killing speed. I do not tell this story to evoke pity. I tell it because it is the moment I understood, truly and completely, what kind of world we had tried to invade. A world where children play with forces that destroy armies, A world where the gap between their weakest and our strongest is so vast that our deaths were not even interesting enough to interrupt their games. That evening, I made a decision that I knew would end my career and possibly my life. I opened a secure channel to Subfleet Leader Dreneth and the 3 other surviving corridor commanders, and I spoke the words that no Tyrellan officer is supposed to speak during an active campaign. This invasion is over. We need to leave this world, or we will all die on it. The silence on the channel lasted long enough for me to wonder if the connection had been lost. Then Dreneth spoke, and his voice carried the same resignation I felt in my own chest. He agreed. The commander of the Pacific Force agreed. The Northern Europe Corridor commander, who had lost 40% of her troops in a single engagement when human armored vehicles had driven directly through her positions without slowing down, agreed with a bitterness that I could taste through the communicator. We composed a joint tactical assessment and transmitted it to the high stratagem aboard the command carrier in high orbit. I wrote it myself, on a tactical pad that I had to hold above my chest because I could not sit up, and I chose every word with the knowledge that these words would be read by historians for centuries to come. I recommended full and immediate withdrawal. I detailed the losses. Of 90,000 ground troops deployed across all corridors, fewer than 12,000 could still move under their own power. All ground vehicles were immobilized or destroyed. All heavy equipment was non-functional. The orbital bombardment had failed to damage any significant target. Human military forces had suffered minimal casualties and were continuing to advance at will across all engagement zones. The planet's gravity, atmosphere, climate, and biosphere were inflicting continuous attrition on our forces at a rate that would reduce combat effectiveness to 0 within another 24 hours, even without further human military action. I concluded the assessment with a sentence that I knew would haunt the stratagem. We did not lose to the humans, we lost to their planet, and their planet cannot be negotiated with, intimidated, or destroyed. The stratagem's response arrived 2 hours later, and it was the response of someone who had never set foot on the surface of Earth, and therefore could not understand what I was telling him. He rejected the withdrawal recommendation. He ordered reinforcements, another 100,000 troops from the reserve fleet, to be deployed within 12 hours, with orders to establish a forward operating base and resume the ground campaign. I read the order twice. Then I did something that I had never done in 40 years of service, something that I knew carried a penalty of death under Tyrellan military law, something that I did anyway because I could not, in conscience, allow 100,000 more soldiers to experience what I had experienced. I refused. I transmitted my refusal on the same channel, formally and for the record, and I followed it with every piece of evidence I had. I sent the medical data showing organ failure rates. I sent the combat footage showing our weapons missing targets by meters. I sent the sensor recordings of our vehicles sinking into the ground. I sent the thermal imaging of human soldiers moving through our positions, stepping over prone Tyrellan warriors like they were pieces of furniture. And I sent one image that I had been keeping in reserve because I knew it would communicate what no amount of data could. It was a still frame from a ground-level camera in the Northern European corridor. It showed a human female in civilian clothing, not a soldier, not a government official, an ordinary civilian standing at the edge of a Tyrellan crash site. She was holding a small child on one hip, the way humans carry their young, and in her other hand, she was holding a small device that she was using to take a photograph. Of us. Of the invading alien army that had come to conquer her world, and she was smiling. Not a frightened smile, not a nervous smile, a genuine, relaxed, mildly entertained smile, the kind of expression you wear when you encounter something unexpected and interesting during an otherwise ordinary day. She was not afraid of us. She was not impressed by us. She was taking a picture to show her friends. That image, I later learned, circulated through the fleet within hours, and did more to undermine the stratagem's authority than my refusal ever could, because every officer who saw it understood the same thing I understood. We had come to this world as conquerors, and we were a tourist attraction. The stratagem did not respond to my refusal for 6 hours. During those 6 hours, something else happened that I must include in this debrief, because it changed the trajectory of the entire situation, and because it represents, in my professional assessment, the single most important tactical observation of the entire campaign. The humans sent a delegation. They approached our perimeter from the south, 3 individuals walking in the open with no cover and no visible weapons. One of them was carrying a white cloth on a stick, which our cultural analysts quickly identified as a universal human signal for peaceful intent. They walked straight toward our defensive line, which was less a line and more a scattering of immobile soldiers lying in craters, and they stopped about 10 meters from my command pod and waited. I had them brought to me, which in practice meant 2 of my guards crawled to the delegation and gestured for them to follow, and the 3 humans walked over to my position and knelt down so they could speak to me at eye level. It was a courtesy I did not expect and did not deserve. They could have stood over me. They chose to kneel. The delegation consisted of a military officer, a civilian translator, and a medic. The officer was a tall, calm man who introduced himself through the translator as Lieutenant Colonel Simon Avery of the Brazilian Army. He was polite. He was professional. He was, I could tell, working very hard to keep a straight face, and I respected him for the effort. He carried himself with the bearing of a soldier who had been doing this job for a long time, and he looked at me with an expression that I have since decided was something close to sympathy. He brought water, clean, cold drinking water in sealed containers, carried by hand across 300 meters of jungle by a man who probably did not even notice the weight. He brought medical supplies, including bandages and anti-inflammatory compounds that his medic said would be compatible with most carbon-based physiologies. And he brought a translation device that his engineers had assembled using components from captured Torellan communication equipment, a device they had apparently built in less than a day by reverse engineering our technology with tools designed for a world we could not function in. The terms he offered were simple: surrender all ground forces, withdraw the fleet beyond the orbit of the local moon, open diplomatic channels for future communication, no soldiers would be harmed, no technology would be confiscated beyond what was necessary for immediate security, all wounded would receive medical treatment. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that human medical teams were already treating wounded Torellan soldiers at 3 other crash sites. He said it the way you might mention that someone had tidied up a room, casually. As if carrying alien soldiers who weighed over 100 kilograms in Earth gravity to field hospitals, and treating their injuries was simply what you did when someone fell down on your planet. I accepted the terms. I did not consult the stratagem. I did not request authorization. I accepted them from a stretcher because I could not stand. And when Lieutenant Colonel Avery extended his hand in what the translator explained was a gesture of agreement called a handshake, I gave him my hand, and he closed his fingers around it, and I felt every bone in my fingers compress under a grip that he clearly, unmistakably, considered gentle. It hurt. His gentleness hurt. And I understood, in that moment of small crushed bones and careful human courtesy, that this was what it meant to be fragile on a world built for giants. The withdrawal began 12 hours after I accepted the human terms. The stratagem, faced with the reality of 4 corridor commanders, in open refusal, and a fleet-wide collapse in morale, had finally authorized the retreat, though the formal record would later call it a strategic redeployment, which is the kind of language that people use when they cannot bring themselves to say we lost. The dropships descended to collect surviving ground troops, and this is where the final humiliation occurred, though I am no longer sure humiliation is the right word. Perhaps it was something else. Perhaps it was grace. The Torellan soldiers could not board the dropships. The boarding ramps, designed for homeworld gravity, were inclined at angles that our troops could not climb in Earth's gravitational field. Soldiers who could barely crawl on flat ground could not drag themselves up a 30-degree ramp while carrying their own magnified body weight. The evacuation stalled within minutes, as thousands of soldiers accumulated at the bases of ramps they could not ascend. The humans fixed it. I do not know who gave the order on their side. I do not know if anyone gave an order at all. What I know is that within an hour of the evacuation beginning, human soldiers began appearing at the loading zones. They came in trucks and on foot, hundreds of them, and they did what they had apparently been doing at crash sites across the planet since the first day of the invasion. They carried us. I need to describe this carefully, because I need the stratagem to understand what I saw. I need every officer in the dominance to understand what I saw, because it changes everything we thought we knew about this species and this world. Human soldiers, men and women, some of them barely out of adolescence, walked up to Tyrellan warriors twice their age, and gently, carefully, respectfully, lifted them off the ground and carried them up the boarding ramps. Not dragged, not hauled, carried, the way you carry someone who is injured, with attention to their pain and their dignity. Some of them carried our soldiers in their arms. Some of them fashioned stretchers from materials they found in the jungle. One soldier, a young man whose name I never learned, carried two fully armored Tyrellan warriors up a ramp at the same time, one under each arm, and when he set them down inside the dropship, he turned and looked at me, and he said something that the translator rendered as a question. "Are there more?" He was asking if there were more of us to carry. He had just lifted over 200 kilograms of alien soldier and armor up a steep ramp in full Earth gravity, and he was asking if he could do it again. Not out of obligation, not under orders. Out of what I can only describe as an instinct that ran deeper than any military protocol. An instinct that said when someone is hurt and cannot move, you help them, even if they came to conquer your world. Even if they are the enemy, even if you could just as easily leave them in the dirt. Human engineers jury-rigged ramp supports for the dropships when the original ramps began to buckle under the weight of Earth-heavy loads. They welded reinforcements from scrap metal they cut from our own abandoned vehicles, using tools they carried in their pockets, working in gravity that would have killed any Tyrellan engineer before lunch. They rebuilt our equipment to function on their world faster than we had ever deployed it in the first place. The evacuation took 14 hours. In that time, I watched the species we had come to subjugate work tirelessly to ensure that every last one of our soldiers was safely aboard a dropship. They brought water and food to the loading zones. They treated the wounded who were too fragile to move immediately. They spoke to our soldiers in soft tones that needed no translation, because the sound of kindness is the same in every language. I was one of the last to leave. Lieutenant Colonel Avery came to see me off personally. He helped the medics load my stretcher onto the dropship, and as they carried me up the ramp, he walked beside me and said something that the translator converted into words I will never forget. He said I was a good soldier who had been given a bad mission, and he hoped I would heal well. Then he said something else, something I think he meant as comfort, but which struck me with the force of a revelation. He said that humans had a saying about gravity: what goes up must come down. He said it was one of the first things human children learned, so fundamental to their experience of reality, that they turned it into a proverb, a joke, a piece of common wisdom so obvious that it barely needed saying. What goes up must come down. They built their entire civilization on that principle. They never questioned it. They never imagined that it could be different, that there were worlds where things went up and stayed up, where the pull was gentle and forgiving, where you could leap and float and fall without consequence. They thought their gravity was normal. They thought everyone lived like this. They had no idea they were the heavy ones. The dropship lifted off, and I watched the planet Earth recede through the rear viewport. It looked the same as it had when we arrived, heavy and dark and dense, a world that did not care about us and never would. The fleet assembled at the lunar orbit point and began the long journey back to dominant space, and I lay in my medical cradle and began compiling the damage assessment that would become this debrief. The numbers are in the official record. I will summarize them here, because they deserve to be spoken aloud, not just read on a screen. Total ground forces deployed, 90,000. Total casualties, dead or permanently disabled, 61,412. Total ground vehicles lost, all of them. Total heavy equipment abandoned, all of it. Total ships lost to human weapons fire during the withdrawal, 11. Total duration of the campaign, 39 hours and 14 minutes. The humans lost 187 personnel, mostly in the confused initial skirmishes, before they realized how helpless we were. 187 against 61,000. It was not a battle. It was not even a contest. It was a species adapted to a gravity field, encountering a species that was not, and the outcome was as predictable as falling. I conclude this debrief with a formal strategic recommendation that I urge the high stratagem to adopt immediately and without reservation. The planet Earth should be classified as a permanent exclusion zone, not a future target, not a deferred objective, not a world to be revisited when better technology is available. A permanent, Absolute, non-negotiable exclusion zone. Removed from every conquest list, every strategic assessment, every wargame scenario for the remainder of the dominance's existence. And I make this recommendation not because the humans are aggressive, though they can be, not because their weapons are superior, though on their own world they are, not because their technology is advanced, because by our standards, it is not. I make this recommendation because of something far more fundamental and far more terrifying. The humans were kind to us. I need the stratagem to sit with that statement and understand what it means. They were kind. They carried us. They fed us. They treated our wounds. They returned our dead with respect and ceremony. They offered terms that were generous, to the point of absurdity for a species that had just attempted to invade their planet. And they did all of this not because they were weak, not because they were naive, not because they did not understand the threat we represented. They did it because they could afford to. They were so strong, so fundamentally and structurally and gravitationally superior to us, that our invasion did not frighten them. It did not anger them. It barely inconvenienced them. They were kind to us the way a full-grown creature is kind to a hatchling that wanders into its den, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of a security so absolute that generosity costs nothing. A species forged by 9.8 meters per second squared of unrelenting, crushing, bone-building, muscle-thickening gravitational force does not fear the creatures who crawl at their feet. They pity them, and in that pity lies a message that every civilization in the known galaxy needs to hear. Do not go to Earth. Do not provoke Earth. Do not, under any circumstances, give the humans a reason to leave Earth, because if they ever do, if they ever build ships that carry them to our worlds, to our gentle, low-gravity, fragile worlds, they will walk among us like gods among infants, and we will have no response except to hope that they are as kind to us on our worlds as they were to us on theirs. This concludes my debrief. Fleet Commander Wieshall, Southern Hemisphere Assault Corridor, Torellan Dominance Expeditionary Force. Date of record, 11 rotations after withdrawal. Physical status, 6 fractures unhealed, left lung at 60% capacity, nerve damage to both lower limbs. Career status, pending tribunal for refusal of direct order. I regret nothing, except going to that planet in the first place. There is one more thing. I debated whether to include it because it is not tactical, and it is not strategic, and it does not belong in an official military document. But I am including it because it is the thing I think about when I close my eyes, and because I believe it says more about the humans than any damage report or casualty figure ever could. During the evacuation, while human soldiers were carrying my troops up the boarding ramps, and human engineers were rebuilding our equipment, and human medics were treating our wounded, I saw something through the viewport of my command pod. A kilometer or so from the landing zone, at the edge of a cleared field where the jungle gave way to grass, there was a group of human children. They were playing. There were perhaps a dozen of them, small ones, the youngest maybe 4 or 5 years old by human reckoning. They were running in the grass, chasing each other, tumbling, and getting up and running again. And they were jumping, leaping into the air, with their arms raised, competing to see who could jump the highest, laughing every time they landed, and then jumping again, over and over, launching themselves upward against the full, undiminished, merciless pull of a world that measured its grip in numbers our bodies could not survive, and coming back down hard, on feet that were built for it, on legs that were built for it, on a frame that was built for every punishing, crushing, magnificent second of it. They were fighting gravity, the same gravity that had shattered my ribs and drowned my lungs and broken my army and ended my career. They were fighting it for fun, and they were winning. That is the image I will carry for the rest of my life, not the battle, not the defeat, not the stretcher or the handshake or the ramps we could not climb. The children, jumping in a field, laughing at the force that destroyed us, treating the most powerful enemy I have ever faced as a game. If the stratagem needs a reason to never return to Earth, give him that image. Give him the children, leaping and laughing in the iron grip of a world that builds its creatures out of strength and joy, and an absolute, unconscious, terrifying fearlessness. And tell him that those children will grow up. And when they do, they will be the ones who decide what happens next. Not us. Never us. End of record.